entails the process of taking some level of access, whether it's authorized or not, and then achieving an even greater level of access, subsequently elevating the user's privileges. An example is whenever an attacker gains user mode access to a firewall or a server or a switch, or a router or any infrastructure device, and then uses a privilege escalation vulnerability to gain access to the system and elevate their privileges to, let's say, admin access, right? So in the case of a server or a Linux server, they can elevate their privilege to root, or in the case of a router or a switch or a firewall, they can elevate their privilege to a privilege 15 admin user, right? So that's how a privilege escalation attack actually works. Now, so you may ask, what is actually a code execution attack? And that's whenever threat actors gain access to a system, but then may be able to actually take several actions, right? So the type of action will depend on the level of access the attacker has or can achieve, and it's actually based on the permissions granted to the account compromised by that attacker. Now, one of the most devastating actions available is whenever an attacker has the ability to execute code, and specifically to execute code remotely in a system. So once you actually have access to the device and can execute code, basically all bets are off from that point. So code execution could result in an adverse impact to the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of a system or the whole network. Can be installed by an attacker to either allow future access or to collect information to use in further attacks. So when the threat actor gains access to a system, they usually want future access, right? So they can control the system and they can carry other attacks. And they want that access to be really easy. Now, many backdoors are installed by users clicking something without realizing that the link that they clicked or the file that they opened is actually a threat. A backdoor can be implemented as a result of a malware or as a result of a virus or a worm. And, they're very popular nowadays, to be able to actually gain access to a system and maintain persistence. Now, let's cover what are man-in-the-middle attacks. Man-in-the-middle attack results when the attacker places themselves in line between two devices that are actually communicating. So the reason that they do this is with the intent to perform reconnaissance or to manipulate the data that that is actually being transferred as it moves between those entities. Now, this can happen at layer 2 or at layer 3. The main purpose of this attack is actually to eavesdrop so that the attacker can actually see the traffic and, of course, steal that traffic and manipulate it. Now, if this happens at layer 2, the attacker spoofs the layer 2 MAC address to make the devices on the LAN or the local area network believe that the layer 2 address of the attacker is the layer 2 address of its default gateway. And this is, often, called ARP poisoning. So this is, an example of an ARP poisoning attack. Now, frames that are supposed to go through the default gateway, in that case, they're forwarded by the switch to the layer 2 address of the attacker on that same network. And then as a courtesy, the attacker can actually forward the frames to the correct destination so that the client will have connectivity needed, that they need, and the attacker now sees all the data between the two devices. Now, to mitigate this risk, you can use, techniques like ARP inspection. So ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol. So it's the ARP inspection functionality on Cisco switches to actually prevent spoofing of the layer 2 addresses. Now, the attacker could also implement the attack by placing a switch into the network and manipulating the spanning tree protocol, or STP, to become the root switch, and then therefore, gaining the ability to actually see any traffic that needs to be sent throughout the, root switch. A man-in-the-middle attack can also occur at layer 3, like I mentioned before, and this can be done by a rogue router, being placed on the network, and then tricking the other routers into believing that the new router has a better path, in the network. So this could cause, network traffic to flow through the router, through this rogue router, and again allow the attacker to steal network data, right? So you can mitigate this attack, which many different ways, many different features, and that some of them include the routing authentication protocols, right? So that's a best practice that you should always implement. You should implement the authentication in routing protocols within your organization. Also, you can filter information from being advertised or learn on a specific interfaces, right? So all those best practices will actually mitigate those type of layer 3 rogue router attacks, right? So a man-in-the-middle attack can also occur by compromising the victim's machine, right? So the attacker can install malware that can intercept the packets sent by the victim and send them directly to the attacker, right? So this type of malware can capture packets before they're encrypted, and if the victim, of course, is using TLS or SSL or HTTPS or any other mechanisms, actually those packets are stolen or being sent to the attacker even before they're actually encrypted, right? So think about that you're accessing a bank through your browser, and then of course the attacker can install malware that before the browser actually encrypts the data to the bank, or vice versa after the decryption is actually done. That data can be sent to the attacker. Now, to safeguard data in motion, one of the best things you can do is to use, of course, encryption for the confidentiality of the data in transit. If you use plain text protocols for management, like Telnet or HTTP, definitely you're asking for it. The attacker who has implemented a man-in-the-middle attack can definitely see the contents of those, data packets, the clear text data packets, across the network. So that's why management protocols must have encryption built in. So you should actually use things like Secure Shell or SSH and HTTPS, and definitely consider that as a best practice. And also for in transit traffic, the use of VPN is definitely a given, right? So you want to actually use a VPN to protect and encrypt data, sensitive data that is actually transferred, in a untrusted network like the internet. Waves of these attacks over the past few years. Now, DDoS attacks can be categorized in 3 major categories: direct DDoS attacks, reflected DDoS attacks, and amplification DDoS attacks. Direct DDoS attacks occur when the source of the attack generates the packets, regardless of the protocol, application, and so on, that they are sent directly to the victim of the attack. In this example, the attacker launches a direct DDoS to a web server, which is the victim here, and sending numerous TCP SYN packets, so TCP synchronization packets. And this type of attack is actually aimed to flood the victim with an overwhelming number of packets, and then oversaturating its connection bandwidth or depleting the target's resources in that system. This type of attack is also known as a SYN flood attack, as a TCP SYN flood attack. Cyber criminals also can use DDoS attacks to produce added cost to the victim when the victim is actually using things like cloud services, for example. So in most cases, when you see a cloud service such as Amazon Web Services, or AWS, or some other ones, you actually pay per usage, right? So attackers can actually launch DDoS attacks and cost you to pay more for the users and resources that are being serviced. Another type of DDoS is caused by exploiting vulnerabilities such as a buffer overflow to actually cause a server or even a network infrastructure device to actually crash, to reload, and then subsequently causing a complete denial of service condition. Now, many attackers use botnets to launch DDoS attacks. A botnet is actually a collection of compromised machines where the attacker can manipulate them from a command and control server, or what we call a CNC server or a system, to either participate in a DDoS, in this case, or they can also be compromised and manipulated to actually send spam emails or to perform other illicit activities. Now, this, in this example here, I'm actually showing a botnet that is actually used by the attacker to actually, launch a DDoS attack. And in this example, the actual attacker sends instruction to the command and control box, so that to the CNC, and then subsequently the CNC sends instructions to the bots within the botnet to then launch a DDoS against the victim in this case. Now, the other type of DDoS attacks is a reflected DDoS attack. And reflected DDoS attacks occur when the source or the sources of the attack are sent spoof packets that appear to be from the victim. And then the sources become unwittingly participants of the DDoS attacks by sending the response traffic back to the intended victim. UDP is actually often used as a transport mechanism because it's actually more easy, or it's easier to be spoofed due to the lack of a three-way handshake. Just like UDP is a connectionless protocol and not like TCP that actually has a three-way handshake. So, for example, if the attacker decides that he wants to attack the victim, he will send packets, let's say, NTP packets or, any other type of UDP packet to a source who actually thinks that these packets are legitimate. And then the source then responds to the NTP request, in this case, by sending the responses to the victim. And in this case, the victim who has never been expecting these NTP packets from actually the source, then, of course, cause this denial of service condition. Now, there's another type of denial of service attack called amplification attacks. And these attacks are a form of reflected attacks in which, the response traffic, which is actually sent by the unwitting participants, is actually made up of packets that are much larger than those that were initially sent by the attacker. So, the attacker is actually spoofing the victim in this case. So an example of this is actually when DNS queries are sent to a DNS server, and the DNS responses actually are much larger in the packet size than the initial request of the packet. Subsequently, this is what we call an amplification of the attack, since the responses are actually amplified or are much larger in packet size than the initial query packets that were sent. So the end result is that the victim gets flooded by by those large packets from which it actually never actually issues queries for. So in this example, we actually have 3 DNS servers that are open resolvers, right? So the attacker sends spoof packets to the DNS servers, and these packets are small 64-bit packet. And then the DNS servers amplify those packets to the victim with a much larger size, as you can see from this picture. For data exfiltration. Now, one of the most popular is to use DNS tunneling. We're also seeing, other type of tunneling or other type of encapsulation, things like even ICMP, NTP actually being used to carry, sensitive information outside of the corporate networks. But DNS tunneling has been one of the most commonly used nowadays. We're seeing this used more and more for malware-based data exfiltration out of enterprise networks. Here I'm actually including a Cisco Tallow blog post on the link, which actually has a great example of data exfiltration and also how to detect, some of these DNS data exfiltration techniques. Now, attackers can encapsulate chunks of data into DNS packets to actually steal sensitive information, such as, personal identifiable information, credit card numbers, and a lot more, right? So the sky's the limit. Now, once you actually take, those packets or those informations and divide them into chunks, you can put them in the payload of those DNS packets, or like I mentioned before, NTP or ICMP, any type of packets that is expected to actually be allowed to leave the organization. Now, there are a few examples of DNS tunneling tools used by attackers, and I'm actually including a few here. Things like DNS to TCP, DNS-CAT, Iodine, has a couple of versions of it, Oxymine DNS, SplitBrain, TCP over DNS, as well as your Freedom. Again, these are for your reference. There are many, many other tools and DNS tunneling techniques. I'm actually including here another really good reference from SANS that includes, additional types of tools and DNS exfiltration attacks. So, whenever you're preparing for the exam, I will invite you to actually go through these links and at least become familiar with, these type of techniques and, the type of methods of actually detecting, this type of tunneling. DNS tunneling may be detected by analyzing the DNS packet payload or by traffic analysis like byte count and also the frequency of the DNS request in the network. Before we go over what ARP cache poisoning and route manipulations attacks are, let's refresh on what is a spoofing attack. Basically, a spoofing attack is when an attacker impersonates another device or another IP address or another person to actually execute an attack. The following are a few examples of spoofing attacks. The first one is an IP address spoofing attack, and the attacker in this case sends IP packets from a fake or a spoofed source address in order to actually disguise itself. DDoS attacks typically use spoofing attacks or IP spoofing attacks to make the packets appear from legitimate sources and IP addresses, so they will avoid being blocked. Now, another type of spoofing attack is an ARP spoofing attack, and in this case, the attacker sends a spoof ARP packet across a layer 2 network in order to link the attacker's MAC address with the IP address of a legitimate host. The best practices that we actually cover later in here, will help actually mitigate ARP spoofing attacks. And the other one is actually DNS server spoofing attacks. And in this case, the actual attacker modifies the DNS server in order to reroute a specific domain name to a different IP address. And DNS server spoofing attacks are typically used to spread malware. Now, threat actors can attack host, switches, and routers connected to a layer 2 network by poisoning the ARP cache of systems connected to the subnet and by intercepting traffic intended for other hosts in the subnet. Cisco switches support a feature called dynamic ARP inspection that validates ARP packets and intercepts logs and discards ARP packets with the invalid IP to MAC address binding. Now, this feature also protects the network from certain man-in-the-middle attacks, and the dynamic ARP inspection feature safeguard that only ARP valid requests, so only valid ARP requests and responses are relayed. They do this by performing a few things. First, intercepting all ARP requests and responses on trusted ports, then also verifying that each of the intercepted packet have a valid IP to MAC address binding before updating the local ARP cache, or even before forwarding the packet to the respective destination host. They also dropped invalid ARP packets and determine if an ARP packet is valid based on the IP to MAC address binding stored in a trusted database. And this database is called the DHCP Snooping Binding Database. Now, here there are some additional Layer 2 security best practices for securing your infrastructure against Layer 2 attacks. The first one is actually to select an unused VLAN other than VLAN 1, and then use that for the native VLAN for all your trunks. So don't use VLAN 1, and do not use this native VLAN for any of your enable access ports at all, right? So always avoid using VLAN 1 anywhere because it's actually the default. Now, you can also administratively configure switch ports as access ports so that the users cannot negotiate a trunk and then disable the negotiation of trunking. So, basically no dynamic trunk protocol or DTP. Also, you should limit the number of MAC addresses learned on a given port with a port security feature. You can also enable control spanning tree to stop users or unknown devices from manipulating a spanning tree. And you can do so by using the BPDU guard and root guard features in those switches. You should also turn off Cisco Discovery Protocol on ports that are facing untrusted or unknown networks that do not require CDP for anything positive, right? So CDP actually operates at layer 2 and may provide attackers with information that we will rather not disclose in those ports. Now, on a new switch, shut down all the ports and assign them to a VLAN that is not used for anything else. Then bring up the ports and assign the correct VLANs as the ports are actually allocated and needed, in your environment. Now, there are several other layer 2 security features that can be used to protect your infrastructure, including port security, and this is actually used to limit the number of MAC addresses that can be learned on an access switch port, like I mentioned before, BPDU guard. So if BPDUs show up where they should not, then the switch will protect itself. Another feature is a root guard, like we mentioned before, which actually controls which ports are not allowed to become root ports or on remote switches. And then the dynamic ARP inspection, as we actually covered earlier, right? IP source guard is another one that prevents spoofing of layer 3 information by hosts. 802.1x to authenticate and authorize users before you allow them into the network and to communicate with the rest of the network. DHCP snooping to prevent rogue DHCP servers from impacting the network. Storm control to limit the amount of broadcast and multicast traffic flowing through the switch. And then, of course, access control list, both at layer 3 and layer 2, for traffic control and policy enforcement. There are different route manipulation attacks out there, but one of the most common is a BGP hijacking attack. BGP, as you know, is a dynamic routing protocol that is used to route internet traffic. And basically, the BGP hijacking attack is launched by an attacker by configuring or compromising an edge router in order to announce prefixes that have not been assigned to his or her organization. So if the malicious announcement contains a route that is more specific than the legitimate advertisement, or even if it presents a shorter path, then the victim traffic may be redirected to the attacker, right? And then, of course, all bets are off. This traffic can actually be, monitored and information can be stolen. Now, in the past, threat actors